The fluorescent lights in the Montgomery County Courthouse hummed with an electrical persistence that made Malik Washington's head throb as he sat in the defendant's chair for what felt like the 1,000th time, though it had only been 43 days since his arrest. The Alabama heat seeped through the old building's walls, despite the struggling air conditioning, and sweat gathered at the base of his neck where his public defender had told him to wear a tie, borrowed from his uncle because he didn't own one himself. At 23, Malik had never needed a tie before, had never imagined needing one for this reason, sitting here while 12 strangers decided whether they believed he had robbed a convenience store and shot the clerk who survived, but couldn't remember much except, apparently, that her attacker was a young black man in a grey hoodie. The prosecution was presenting their closing arguments, and District Attorney Tom Bradley moved through the courtroom like he owned it, which in many ways he did, having won 92% of his cases over the past 15 years. He pointed at Malik with the kind of theatrical certainty that played well in Montgomery County, where people liked their justice swift and their verdicts decisive. Malik's mother sat in the gallery behind him, her hands folded so tightly he could see her knuckles had gone pale even from where he sat. She'd taken out a second mortgage on the house to pay for a lawyer before realizing they couldn't afford even the cheapest one. And now they were left with Kevin Martinez, a public defender who was juggling 47 other cases and had mixed up Malik's name twice during the trial. 800 miles north in Toledo, Ohio, Sarah Chen sat in a different kind of chair, plastic and bolted to a metal table in the Lucas County Correctional Center, waiting for her children to be brought in for their weekly 15-minute visit. The guards had told her she was lucky to get even that, considering she'd been convicted of selling drugs within 1,000 feet of a school, though the drugs had been planted by her ex-boyfriend, who'd cut a deal with the prosecutors to testify against her in exchange for dropping his own charges. Sarah had been a pharmacy technician before this, had never even gotten a speeding ticket, but none of that mattered now as she watched her 7-year-old daughter and 5-year-old son walk in with her sister, their guardian now, their eyes confused and desperate in a way that made Sarah's chest feel like it might collapse. Meanwhile, in a detention center in San Diego, Javier Morales lay on a thin mattress, listening to the man in the next cell crying again, the sound echoing off concrete walls that held stories of 100 other men waiting for trials that might never come or had already gone wrong. Javier had been in the United States for 12 years, had built a small landscaping business, had just put a down payment on a house in Chula Vista when the police arrested him for a series of home invasions based on a witness identification that consisted of Hispanic male, medium height, dark hair. The witness had picked him out of a lineup after the detective suggested he look closer at number 3, which was Javier, standing there in shock because he'd been at his daughter's quinceañera planning meeting when the robbery occurred, though the detective seemed uninterested in verifying his alibi. The one thread connecting these 3 lives, though none of them knew it yet, was a woman named Evelyn Rhodes, who sat in her cramped office in Washington, D.C., surrounded by boxes of case files and transcripts, working 18-hour days for the Innocent Lives Foundation she'd founded 3 years after quitting her job as a federal prosecutor. Evelyn had won awards for her conviction rate, had been on track to become a judge, until the day she learned that a man she'd sent to death row had been innocent, executed while she was accepting an award for excellence in prosecution. That night, she'd gone home and thrown up until there was nothing left, then spent the next 6 months unable to sleep without seeing Marcus Williams' face, the man whose life she'd helped end with her brilliant closing arguments and unshakable certainty. Back in Montgomery, the jury was deliberating Malik's fate, and his lawyer was outside smoking his 4th cigarette in an hour, telling Malik's mother that they should prepare for the worst because the evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling to a jury that was 11/12 white in a county where young black men were convicted at rates that would have been shocking if anyone had been paying attention. Malik thought about his job at the auto parts store, how his manager had already replaced him, how his girlfriend had stopped answering his calls after the second week, how his whole life had dissolved like sugar in water the moment those handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He'd been walking home from his shift, had actually helped an elderly woman with her groceries 2 blocks from where the robbery occurred, but she was too frightened to testify, and the timestamp on the store's security camera was 40 minutes off. A detail his lawyer had failed to notice until it was too late to enter into evidence. Sarah's children were asking her when she was coming home, and she forced herself to smile, to tell them soon, baby, soon, while knowing that her sentence was 7 years minimum, that they would be teenagers before she could tuck them into bed again. Her daughter had drawn her a picture of their family, stick figures holding hands in front of a house with smoke coming from the chimney, and Sarah held it like it was made of gold, knowing the guards would confiscate it as soon as the visit ended because drawings could allegedly be used to pass coded messages. The real criminal, Derek, was probably in Miami by now, living off the money he'd stolen from their joint account while she sat here paying for his crimes, though the prosecutor had painted her as a calculating drug dealer who'd used her children as cover for her operation. In San Diego, Javier's wife, Maria, was meeting with their 3rd lawyer, having exhausted their savings on the first 2 who'd taken their money and done nothing but file paperwork incorrectly. She worked 3 jobs now, cleaning offices at night, working at a grocery store during the day, babysitting on weekends, trying to keep their house while paying for lawyers, and sending money to Javier for commissary. Their eldest daughter, Sophia, had stopped going to school, too ashamed to face her classmates, who whispered about her father, the criminal, though she'd been planning to give a valedictorian speech just 6 months ago. The American dream they'd worked so hard to build was crumbling, and Maria was beginning to understand that justice in America was something you purchased, not something you deserved. Evelyn Rhodes was reading through Malik's case file, one of hundreds that arrived at her foundation each month, most of which they had to turn away due to limited resources. Something about his case bothered her, a detail in the witness statement that didn't align with the security footage she'd managed to obtain through a contact at the FBI. She'd been a prosecutor long enough to recognize when a case had been rushed, when the police had decided on a suspect and then built the evidence around him rather than following the evidence to the perpetrator. She picked up her phone and called James Patterson, a former detective turned private investigator who'd helped her on 7 cases so far, 5 of which had resulted in exonerations. "I need you to go to Montgomery," she said, and James, who'd been expecting her call, was already packing his bag. The jury returned a guilty verdict for Malik after 4 hours of deliberation, and the sound his mother made when the foreman read it was something between a gasp and a scream, a sound that would haunt Malik in his cell for years to come. The judge, Harold Conway, who'd been on the bench for 23 years and had developed a reputation for harsh sentences, gave Malik 25 to life, saying he needed to send a message to the community that violent crime would not be tolerated. Malik stood there, his legs shaking, thinking about how he'd never even held a gun, how the closest he'd come to violence was breaking up a fight between 2 kids at the community center where he volunteered on weekends. A detail that hadn't made it into the trial because his lawyer had forgotten to submit the character witnesses in time. Sarah was in the prison library when she found a book about wrongful convictions, and she read it in one sitting, recognizing her own story in every chapter, the way the system seemed designed to convict rather than to find truth. She started writing letters to innocence organizations, teaching herself legal terminology from law books that were 15 years out of date, the only ones the prison library had. Her handwriting, once neat and precise from years of writing prescriptions, had become cramped and urgent, racing to get everything down before lights out, before another day passed with her children growing up without her. She wrote to 23 organizations before getting a response from the Innocent Lives Foundation, a single line that said they were reviewing her case, but it was enough to make her cry for the first time since her conviction, because it meant someone somewhere believed she might be telling the truth. Javier had stopped eating regularly, not from depression, but from practical calculation, saving his commissary money to call his lawyer, who charged by the minute for phone consultations. He'd lost 30 pounds, his once strong frame from years of physical labor now gaunt, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut. The other detainees had started calling him Ghost because of how he seemed to fade into the background, but really he was observing everything, taking notes on a contraband notepad about the guards' shifts, the other inmates' stories, the way the system worked from inside, thinking maybe if he ever got out, he could help others navigate this maze of legal procedures and informal rules that no one explained, but everyone was expected to know. As the sun set over 3 different American cities, Malik was processed into the state penitentiary, Sarah was teaching another inmate to read in exchange for protection, and Javier was standing for count, just another number in a system that had stopped seeing any of them as human beings the moment they were accused. But 500 miles away, Evelyn Rhodes was working through the night, her desk lamp the only light in the office building, piecing together the truth that the justice system had been too busy, too biased, or too broken to find. She didn't know yet that these 3 cases would become connected, that in fighting for one, she would uncover evidence for the others. That sometimes the system's failures were so systematic they left a trail of innocent lives that, when connected, revealed the true scope of American justice's blind spots. For now, she was just reading, taking notes, and preparing to do what she'd done 43 times before, prove that the truth still mattered, even when it came too late. 6 months had passed since Malik's conviction, when James Patterson finally found the evidence that would change everything, though it would take another year for anyone to listen. He'd been sitting in a diner off Highway 231 in Montgomery, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and reviewing witness statements when the owner, Betty Harmon, mentioned something about the security system at the convenience store where the robbery had occurred. She knew the owner had actually helped him install the cameras 3 years back, and she knew something the police hadn't bothered to check. There was a backup system that uploaded to a cloud server, and the timestamps on those files couldn't be altered like the ones on the local hard drive. James nearly knocked over his coffee in his rush to get up, leaving a $20 bill on the counter for a $3 cup of coffee because Betty Harmon had just possibly saved an innocent man's life. Sarah had become something of a jailhouse lawyer by then, helping 17 other women with their appeals in exchange for small favors like extra phone time or protection from the women who ran the yard. She discovered that the prosecutor in her case, Michael Brennan, had failed to disclose that the key witness against her, her ex-boyfriend Derek, had been facing charges that could have put him away for 20 years before mysteriously getting a deal for time served if he testified. This was a Brady violation, something Sarah had learned about from a legal textbook published in 1987, but it was still the law, and it meant the prosecution had withheld evidence that could have changed her verdict. She wrote to Evelyn Rhodes again, this time with legal citations and a 12-page brief that she'd typed on a typewriter from 1962 that skipped every third E, so she had to go back and write them in by hand. In San Diego, Javier's case had taken a different turn when another man, Roberto Villanueva, was arrested for a home invasion and confessed to the crimes Javier had been accused of. But the district attorney's office was refusing to drop the charges against Javier, claiming that they could have been working together despite no evidence of the 2 men ever meeting. Maria had started a petition that had gathered 12,000 signatures, and local news had picked up the story. But the system moved at its own pace, indifferent to the lives it held in suspension. Javier watched the news coverage from the detention center's common room, seeing his own face on the screen described as alleged victim of mistaken identity, while knowing that every day inside was another piece of his soul being carved away. Evelyn had taken on all 3 cases by then, seeing patterns in the prosecutorial misconduct that suggested something more than individual failures. She'd hired 2 more attorneys with a grant from a foundation run by a tech billionaire who'd had his own run-in with false accusations, and they were working out of an office that used to be a Chinese restaurant, the smell of old grease still clinging to the walls, no matter how many times they cleaned. Her team included Marcus Brown, a former public defender who'd burned out after watching too many innocent clients get convicted, and Jennifer Liu, a recent law school graduate who'd turned down offers from corporate firms to work for a third of the salary because her own father had spent 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit before DNA evidence freed him. The visiting room at the state penitentiary, where Malik was housed, smelled like industrial disinfectant and desperation, and Evelyn sat across from him, separated by scratched plexiglass that made everyone look guilty just by being behind it. Malik had aged 5 years in the 6 months since his conviction, grey appearing at his temples though he was only 24, his eyes carrying a weight that Evelyn recognized from the 43 other innocent people she'd helped free. She told him about the cloud server footage, how it showed him at the auto parts store during the robbery, how James had gotten affidavits from 3 customers who remembered seeing him there but hadn't been contacted by his original lawyer. Malik didn't cry, didn't even smile, just nodded slowly, like he'd learned not to hope too hard because hope in prison was a luxury that could kill you if you let it grow too large. Sarah's children visited the following week, and her daughter, now 8, asked why the lady on TV said Mommy might come home soon. The local news had run a segment on prosecutorial misconduct in Ohio, featuring Sarah's case prominently, and suddenly people who'd assumed her guilt were writing letters of support, though Sarah noticed none of them apologized for their assumptions. Her sister, Linda, who'd aged 10 years in the past 18 months from the stress of raising Sarah's children while working full-time, told her that the pharmacy where Sarah used to work had offered her job back if she was released, though they'd been the first to assume her guilt when the charges were filed. Sarah held her children as tight as the guards would allow, which wasn't very tight at all, and tried not to think about all the bedtime stories she'd missed, all the scraped knees she hadn't been there to bandage, all the moments that had passed while she sat in a cage for someone else's crime. Javier's wife, Maria, had become an activist almost by accident, speaking at rallies about immigration detention and wrongful convictions, her voice growing stronger with each speech, though she'd never been comfortable with public speaking before. She told crowds about how her husband had built his business from nothing, how he'd employed 15 people, how he'd coached youth soccer and had never even gotten a parking ticket. But none of that mattered when a witness pointed at him in a lineup after being coached by detectives eager to close a case. The other detainees had started calling Javier Professor because he was teaching English classes to pass the time, using a grammar book his daughter had sent him, finding purpose in helping others navigate the system that had trapped them all. The breakthrough in Malik's case came when James Patterson found the actual perpetrator, or rather, when the perpetrator found him. Curtis Webb, serving time in Georgia for armed robbery, had seen the news coverage and reached out through his lawyer, wanting to clear his conscience before his terminal cancer took him. He provided details only the real shooter would know, including where he'd thrown the gun, which was recovered exactly where he said it would be, still containing his fingerprints and DNA. The Montgomery County District Attorney's Office fought the new evidence, claiming Webb was lying for attention. But Evelyn had dealt with this kind of institutional pride before, the inability to admit error that kept innocent people locked up, even when the truth was undeniable. Sarah's breakthrough was quieter, but no less significant. Evelyn's team had tracked down Derek in Florida, where he was serving time for another crime, and got him to recant his testimony on video, admitting that the prosecutors had threatened him with life in prison if he didn't testify against Sarah, had even given him a script of what to say. The video was shaky, recorded on a contraband phone in a prison bathroom, but Derek's confession was clear. Sarah had never sold drugs, had never even known he was dealing until the police showed up at her door. The prosecutor, Michael Brennan, was running for judge and denied any wrongdoing. But 3 other cases with similar patterns of coerced testimony were coming to light, and the media was starting to pay attention to what Evelyn had known all along. This wasn't about bad apples, but about a system that rewarded convictions over truth. For Javier, freedom came suddenly when Roberto Villanueva provided detailed confessions to all the crimes, including information about where he'd sold the stolen items that matched pawn shop records. The district attorney dropped the charges on a Friday afternoon, hoping to avoid media attention. But Maria had organized 50 supporters to be there when Javier walked out, and the image of him collapsing into his wife's arms made the front page of the San Diego Union Tribune. He'd lost 18 months of his life, his business, most of their savings, but he was free, though freedom felt different now, like wearing clothes that no longer fit quite right. Evelyn filed appeals for Malik and Sarah simultaneously, using a strategy she'd developed over years of fighting wrongful convictions, overwhelming the system with evidence while simultaneously applying public pressure through media coverage. She'd learned that innocence alone wasn't enough, that you needed to make it politically costly for the system to maintain the conviction, to make the injustice so visible that ignoring it became worse than admitting error. She organized press conferences with family members, got celebrities to tweet about the cases, had law professors write op-eds about the legal failures, all while her team prepared meticulous legal briefs that left no room for technical rejection. The prison library where Sarah spent most of her time had become a sort of classroom, with her teaching other inmates about their rights, about Brady violations and ineffective counsel claims, about the difference between actual innocence and procedural errors. She'd become the person everyone came to with their legal questions, the one who could translate the impenetrable language of the law into something like hope. When word came that her appeal had been granted and she would get a new trial, the entire wing cheered, not just for her, but for what it meant. That sometimes, if you fought hard enough and long enough and smart enough, the truth could still matter. Malik's mother had sold her house to pay for the appeals, moving in with her sister and working 2 jobs to cover the additional legal costs that even Evelyn's pro bono work couldn't eliminate. She visited him every week, driving 3 hours each way, bringing news from the outside world and the kind of food that reminded him he was still human, still her son, still the boy who'd graduated high school with honors and had been planning to study engineering at community college before his arrest. When Evelyn told them that Curtis Webb's confession, combined with the cloud server footage, had convinced an appeals court to overturn the conviction, Malik's mother collapsed in the visiting room, and for the first time since his arrest, Malik allowed himself to cry. The tears coming so hard, they scared him because he'd forgotten he still had that much feeling left inside. The wheels of justice ground slowly but inevitably toward truth, or at least toward a version of it that the system could accept. Sarah's new trial was scheduled for 6 months out, but the prosecutor, facing a federal investigation for his pattern of misconduct, offered a deal: time served if she pled to a misdemeanor. Evelyn advised against it, said they could win at trial, but Sarah thought about her children, about how they needed her now, not in another year after appeals and procedures, and she took the deal even though it meant she'd never be truly exonerated, would always have that mark on her record, that asterisk next to her innocence. She walked out of Lucas County Correctional Center on a Tuesday morning in March, her children running toward her in the parking lot, and she fell to her knees to catch them, to hold them, to breathe them in like oxygen after drowning. The conference room at the Innocent Lives Foundation had been transformed into what Evelyn called their war room, with timelines covering every wall, boxes of evidence stacked to the ceiling, and 3 coffee makers running continuously because sleep had become a luxury they couldn't afford. It had been 2 years since Malik's conviction, 18 months since Sarah's release, and 6 months since Javier's freedom, but the fight was far from over. Malik was still waiting for his new trial date, the system moving with deliberate slowness, as if hoping everyone would forget, would move on, would accept that sometimes innocent people just had to serve time for the convenience of maintaining the illusion that the system worked. Sarah had returned to work at the pharmacy, but everything was different now. Customers who recognized her from the news coverage either avoided her entirely or treated her with a pity that felt almost worse than suspicion. She'd moved to a smaller apartment because her credit had been destroyed during her incarceration, and her children had nightmares that she tried to soothe while dealing with her own trauma that manifested in checking the locks 17 times before bed and having panic attacks whenever she saw police cars. The therapy sessions that Evelyn's foundation had arranged helped, but healing wasn't linear, and some days Sarah felt like she was still in that cell, that this freedom was just another dream she'd wake up from when the guards called for count. Javier had tried to rebuild his landscaping business, but most of his former clients had found other services, and the stigma of his arrest followed him like a shadow. He'd started working construction, his body remembering the rhythm of physical labor, even as his mind struggled to adjust to a world that had moved on without him. Maria had become a full-time advocate, working with immigration rights organizations and speaking at law schools about the intersection of immigration status and wrongful convictions, how being Latino in America meant you were always one witness misidentification away from losing everything. Their daughter Sophia had started college, studying criminal justice with a focus on innocence work, turning her family's trauma into purpose, though Javier worried she was sacrificing her youth to fix a system that had stolen his middle age. The news that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus Brown burst into Evelyn's office with a laptop and an expression of disbelief mixed with rage. He'd been investigating patterns in wrongful convictions across the South and had discovered something that connected not just Malik, Sarah, and Javier's cases, but 47 others across 12 states. There was a company, Forensic Solutions, Inc., that provided expert witnesses for prosecutions, and their experts had a perfect record of supporting convictions, never once testifying that evidence was insufficient or questionable. The company was owned by a shell corporation that, after weeks of digging, Marcus had traced back to a group of former prosecutors who'd found a way to monetize the justice system's need for certainty. Malik received this news in his cell, where he'd been teaching himself coding from outdated textbooks, preparing for a future that might never come. The forensic expert who testified that the partial fingerprint at the scene, consistent with Malik's, had been paid $12,000 by the prosecution, a detail that hadn't been disclosed at trial. This expert, Dr. Richard Hawkins, had testified in 34 cases, all convictions, and when Evelyn's team had hired an independent expert to review his work, they'd found fundamental flaws in his methodology that any first-year forensics student should have caught. Malik wrote in his journal that night something he'd started doing to maintain his sanity, that he'd always thought justice was blind, but now he understood it was actually for sale. Sarah joined a support group for exonerated women that met in the basement of a Baptist church, 8 women sitting in a circle sharing stories that sounded like variations on a theme: prosecutors who hid evidence, defenders who didn't defend, witnesses who lied, and systems that didn't care. The facilitator, a woman named Grace who'd served 12 years for killing a husband who'd actually died of an overdose, talked about secondary trauma, about how freedom didn't mean free, about how they'd all been given life sentences, even if they'd been released. Sarah found comfort in their shared experience, but also a deep anger that there were enough wrongfully convicted women in just her city to form a support group. The media attention around Forensic Solutions, Inc. exploded when a whistleblower from inside the company contacted Evelyn with documents showing that they'd knowingly provided false testimony, that they had a sliding scale of certainty based on how much the prosecution was willing to pay, that they'd even manufactured evidence in at least 3 cases. The story ran on 60 Minutes, with Evelyn presenting the evidence while photos of Malik, Sarah, Javier, and dozens of others flickered across the screen, faces of people whose lives had been destroyed by purchased testimony and institutional indifference. The segment won an Emmy, but Malik watched it from his cell and thought about how his story had become content, his suffering transformed into ratings, his innocence into entertainment for people who'd change the channel and forget his name by morning. Javier testified before Congress about his experience, standing in front of senators who seemed more interested in scoring political points than understanding how the system had failed. He spoke carefully, his English perfect despite the nerves that made his hands shake, describing the moment the detective had pointed at him in the lineup, how it felt to know the truth didn't matter if someone with authority decided otherwise. One senator asked him if he was angry at America, and Javier thought for a long moment before answering that he wasn't angry at America, but at the distance between what America claimed to be and what it actually was, between the promise of justice for all and the reality of justice for some. The investigation into forensic solutions led to a broader FBI probe into what they called the conviction industrial complex, a network of private companies, prosecutors, and judges who'd turned the justice system into a business model. Sarah's prosecutor, Michael Brennan, was indicted on 17 counts of prosecutorial misconduct, though he maintained his innocence with the same fervor he'd once used to convict her. The district attorney in Malik's case quietly announced his retirement, though everyone knew it was to avoid the coming storm. But for every official held accountable, there were dozens who simply moved to different jurisdictions, carrying their methods and their contempt for truth with them, like a virus spreading through the body of American justice. Evelyn's foundation grew from 3 people to 30, funded by donations that poured in after the 60 Minutes segment, and a grant from the Department of Justice that felt like blood money to Evelyn, but which she took anyway because innocent people needed help more than she needed moral purity. They moved to a real office, one with windows and functioning air conditioning, though Evelyn kept the old desk from the Chinese restaurant as a reminder of where they'd started. She hired investigators, forensic experts, social workers, and therapists, building an organization that didn't just free the innocent, but tried to help them rebuild their lives after freedom. Malik's new trial was finally scheduled, after the appeals court ruled that the withheld evidence and the discredited forensic testimony constituted a fundamental miscarriage of justice. Evelyn assigned her best attorney, David Kim, a former prosecutor who'd quit after convicting a man he later learned was innocent and who worked every case like he was seeking redemption for that original sin. The retrial would be different, Evelyn promised Malik, because now they knew the truth, had the evidence, had public opinion on their side. But Malik had learned not to trust promises from anyone in a suit, had learned that hope was something you rationed in prison like contraband, keeping just enough to survive, but not enough to be destroyed when it was inevitably taken away. Sarah started writing a book about her experience, typing late at night after her children were asleep, trying to capture not just what had happened, but what it had felt like. The weight of accusation, the suffocation of incarceration, the complexity of freedom, when everyone knew you'd been in prison, even if they'd learned you were innocent. Publishers were interested, offering advances that would have seemed like fortunes before, but now felt like attempts to purchase her pain, to transform her trauma into a commodity that could be marketed and sold. She took the deal anyway, because her children needed college funds and therapy and a chance at lives unmarked by their mother's false conviction. The Forensic Solutions trial became a sensation, with former employees testifying about pressure to support prosecutions, about reports altered to strengthen cases, about a corporate culture that valued convictions over truth. Dr. Richard Hawkins, the expert who'd testified against Malik, claimed he'd been following standard procedures, that certainty was what prosecutors needed, what juries expected, what the system demanded. Under cross-examination, he admitted he'd never actually examined the original evidence in Malik's case, had based his testimony on photos and reports provided by the prosecution, had been certain about something he'd never really seen. The revelation sent shockwaves through hundreds of cases where he'd testified, each one now suspect, each conviction now questionable. Javier started a non-profit called Proof of Innocence that provided support for immigrants facing wrongful convictions, staffing it with formerly incarcerated people who understood the system from the inside. They offered translation services, helped families navigate the legal system, raised bail money, and provided the kind of support that might have made a difference in his own case. Maria ran the family support program, organizing childcare during trials, helping families understand the process, creating a community of people who understood that accusation didn't mean guilt, that the system could be wrong, that sometimes fighting for truth meant standing against institutions that claimed to embody it. As autumn arrived, the leaves in D.C. turned gold and red, and Evelyn stood in her office looking at the wall of photos, faces of people her foundation had helped free. 47 now, with more cases pending, each one a story of systemic failure and personal resilience. Malik's photo would be moved to the freed wall soon, she hoped, though she'd learned never to assume anything when it came to the justice system. Sarah had sent a recent picture of her with her children at a school play, all of them smiling, though Evelyn could see the shadows that would probably never fully leave Sarah's eyes. Javier's photo showed him at a naturalization ceremony for new citizens, speaking about the America he still believed in despite everything, the one that existed in moments of justice, even if it was absent in systems of law. The fight continued because it had to, because there were thousands more like Malik still in cells, like Sarah still bearing the weight of false accusation, like Javier still trying to rebuild lives destroyed by systematic failures presented as individual crimes. Evelyn often thought about her time as a prosecutor, how certain she'd been, how she'd confused conviction rates with justice, how she'd been part of the very system she now fought against. Redemption, she'd learned, wasn't a destination, but a practice, a daily choice to do better, to know better, to fight for the truth even when the truth was complicated and painful and politically inconvenient. The phone rang with another case, another innocent person trapped in the machinery of American justice, and Evelyn answered it because that's what she did now, what she would do until the system changed, or she died trying to change it, whichever came first. The courtroom in Montgomery was packed for Malik Washington's retrial, 3 years and 7 months after his original conviction. The same building, the same judge's bench, but everything else had changed. The gallery was full of media, activists and law students who'd studied his case in their innocence clinics. Malik sat at the defense table in a suit that actually fit him this time, purchased by his mother, with money raised through a GoFundMe that had collected $43,000 in 2 weeks. He'd aged a decade in less than 4 years, his hair now more grey than black, his face carved with lines that told the story of surviving in a place designed to break men. But his eyes were clear, focused, ready for whatever came next, because he'd already survived the worst thing the system could do to him, short of execution. David Kim's opening statement was a masterclass in controlled fury, laying out not just Malik's innocence, but the systematic failures that had led to his conviction. The cloud server footage that proved Malik was at work during the robbery. The dying confession of Curtis Webb, recorded on video 2 weeks before his death from cancer. The discredited forensic testimony that had been purchased like a product from a catalogue of convictions. The jury, more diverse this time, listened with attention that the first jury hadn't given, perhaps because innocence was no longer an abstract concept, but something the news had made real through stories of exonerations and prosecutorial misconduct. District Attorney Tom Bradley had retired suddenly, replaced by a younger prosecutor named Janet Morrison, who seemed more interested in justice than statistics. though Malik had learned not to trust anyone from that office. Sarah Chen was in the gallery, having driven from Ohio to support Malik, though they'd never met in person. She recognized something in his posture, the way he held himself carefully, like someone who'd learned that any sudden movement could be interpreted as aggression, any emotion as guilt. Her children were in school, but she'd felt compelled to be here, to witness someone else's fight for freedom, to remember that her own freedom had come from people who'd shown up when it mattered. During a break, she introduced herself to Malik's mother, two women bonded by a specific kind of grief that came from watching their children caged for crimes they didn't commit. They didn't need to say much. The understanding passed between them in a glance, a hand squeeze, a shared knowledge of sleepless nights and mortgaged futures. Javier Morales had sent a letter that David Kim read aloud during the trial, describing his own experience with misidentification, the way the system seemed designed to confirm its initial assumptions rather than seek truth. Every innocent person in prison, Javier had written, is a crime scene with no tape, a violation with no investigation, a theft of life that no one counts in the statistics. The letter had been translated from Spanish by his daughter Sofia, who was now in her second year of law school, her professor having excused her from classes to work on amicus briefs for cases like Malik's. The cycle of trauma becoming purpose, of victims becoming advocates, of the wronged becoming the righteous. When Curtis Webb's video confession was played, the courtroom fell silent, except for the labored breathing of a dying man admitting to shooting a convenience store clerk, describing details that had been withheld from public reports, explaining that he'd worn a grey hoodie he'd stolen from a donation bin, the same generic description that had led police to Malik. Webb had died before he could testify in person, but his words carried the weight of someone with nothing left to lose, including the fear of truth. The prosecution tried to argue that Webb might have been lying, seeking attention in his final days, but David Kim presented Webb's criminal history, showing a pattern of similar robberies with identical methods, none of which Malik could have committed since he'd been verifiably elsewhere. The forensic expert who testified this time was Dr. Angela Foster from MIT, who systematically destroyed the previous testimony, explaining how partial fingerprints could match thousands of people, how the certainty expressed by the prosecution's expert had been scientifically impossible, how the entire field of forensic evidence had been corrupted by prosecutors who wanted certainty in an uncertain world. She used terms like confirmation bias and contextual bias, explaining how investigators who believed they had the right suspect would unconsciously interpret evidence to support that belief. The prosecution's new expert admitted under cross-examination that the evidence was inconclusive at best, a phrase that would have saved Malik 3 years of his life if anyone had said it at the first trial. During lunch breaks, Evelyn Rhodes coordinated with her team from a makeshift command center in a hotel room across from the courthouse. They were monitoring social media, feeding information to journalists, making sure this retrial couldn't be ignored or minimized. She'd learned that justice required not just legal arguments, but public pressure, that courts responded to scrutiny, that judges and prosecutors cared about their reputations, sometimes more than they cared about the law. The hashtag, Justice for Malik, had been trending for 3 days, and celebrities who'd never heard of Montgomery, Alabama, were tweeting about the case, their millions of followers learning about prosecutorial misconduct and wrongful convictions through the lens of one man's story. Malik took the stand on the 3rd day, something his original lawyer had advised against, but which David Kim knew was necessary. Malik spoke quietly but clearly about the moment of his arrest, the disbelief that had given way to terror, the certainty that truth would prevail, that had curdled into understanding that truth was just one factor among many in a system that valued closure over accuracy. He described his time in prison not with self-pity, but with a kind of anthropological detachment, explaining the economy of commissary, the politics of respect, The way innocent men were actually in more danger because they hadn't learned the codes that guilty men knew instinctively. When the prosecutor asked him if he was angry, Malik paused for a long moment before saying, "Anger is a luxury I couldn't afford. Survival took all my energy. But now, free or not, I want accountability. Not revenge, but accountability." The medical examiner testified that Curtis Webb's DNA had been found on evidence that the original investigation had never tested, evidence that had sat in a storage locker for 3 years while Malik sat in a cell. The original detective, brought back to testify, admitted under harsh questioning that he'd been under pressure to close the case quickly, that there had been 3 similar robberies, and the public was demanding action, that once they'd identified Malik as a suspect based on the vague description, they'd stopped looking for anyone else. He used the passive voice constantly. Mistakes were made, procedures weren't followed, as if the investigation had failed on its own rather than through human choices that had destroyed an innocent man's life. Sarah watched the detective's testimony and felt her chest tighten with familiar rage. It was the same language the police had used in her case, the same deflection of responsibility, the same implication that wrongful convictions were acts of God rather than human failures. She thought about the support group, about Grace and the other women, about how many times they'd heard variations of mistakes were made without anyone admitting to making them. After court that day, she found Malik's mother crying in the bathroom and held her while she sobbed, 2 strangers united by a grief that shouldn't exist in a functioning justice system. The jury deliberated for exactly 47 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The forewoman, a black woman who looked directly at Malik as she spoke, said the words clearly and firmly, as if she understood she was speaking not just a legal verdict, but a moral correction. Malik's mother made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scream, and Malik himself sat perfectly still for a moment before slowly putting his head in his hands. Sarah saw his shoulders shaking and realized he was crying, the kind of tears that came when you'd held them back so long they'd turned to poison in your veins. But the victory was incomplete, as these victories always were. The judge apologized for the miscarriage of justice, but stopped short of condemning the system that had allowed it. The prosecutor announced they wouldn't retry the case, as if they were doing Malik a favor, rather than acknowledging they'd never had a case to begin with. The media covered the verdict as a triumph of the justice system, proof that it could self-correct, rather than an indictment of a system that had taken 3 years and 7 months to admit what had been true all along. Malik Washington was innocent. The next morning, Malik walked out of county jail for the last time, his possessions in a clear plastic bag, the same clothes he'd been arrested in now hanging loose on his frame. Evelyn had arranged for compensation lawyers to meet with him, explaining that Alabama had a law providing $50,000 for each year of wrongful incarceration, though it required proving innocence beyond doubt, and the state would fight every claim. Malik laughed at that, a sound without humor, noting that he'd had to prove his innocence to a higher standard than the state had needed to prove his guilt. The money would help, would maybe let his mother get her house back, but it couldn't buy back the years, couldn't erase the trauma, couldn't restore the life he'd been building before the system decided he was guilty of existing while black in the wrong place at the wrong time. A week later, there was a gathering at the Innocent Lives Foundation, a celebration that felt more like a wake for the people Malik, Sarah, and Javier had been before their convictions. They sat together on Evelyn's office couch, 3 people who'd never asked to be symbols, but had become them anyway. Sarah talked about how her daughter still had nightmares about police taking her away again. Javier described customers crossing the street to avoid him, the permanent suspicion that exoneration couldn't erase. Malik said he'd been accepted to an online engineering program but couldn't concentrate, couldn't remember what it felt like to plan for a future that extended beyond the next count, the next meal, the next day survived. The conversation turned to what came next, and they found themselves planning without meaning to, Sarah would expand her book to include Malik and Javier's stories, creating a trilogy of innocence that publishers were already bidding on. Javier would hire Malik for his non-profit once Malik felt ready, understanding that employment after incarceration was nearly impossible even for the exonerated. They would speak at law schools, train public defenders, lobby for reforms that might prevent the next Malik, Sarah, or Javier from losing years to a system that measured success in convictions rather than truth. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., and casting long shadows through the office windows, Evelyn looked at these 3 survivors and thought about the 44 others her foundation had freed, the hundreds more they were working on, the thousands they'd never reach. The system hadn't changed. Not really. Prosecutors still hid evidence, forensic experts still testified to certainties that didn't exist, and poor defendants still received defenses that were barely worth the name. But something had shifted, some small recognition that wrongful convictions weren't anomalies, but features of a system designed to produce convictions efficiently rather than justice carefully. Malik stood to leave, and Sarah and Javier stood with him, an unconscious solidarity of people who'd survived the same storm. They exchanged numbers, made plans to stay in touch, knowing that no one else would really understand what they'd been through, what they continued to go through every day. Trauma, Evelyn had learned, wasn't something you recovered from, but something you learned to carry. And these 3 had learned to carry theirs with a dignity that the system had tried but failed to strip from them. 3 months later, Malik testified before the Alabama legislature about criminal justice reform, wearing the same suit he'd worn to his retrial, speaking to politicians who listened with the practiced attention of people who'd already decided their votes. He talked about the cost of wrongful convictions, not just the $50,000 per year the state would have to pay him, but the cost of the real perpetrator remaining free, the cost of public trust eroded, the cost of a generation of young black men who knew the system, saw them as guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes not even then. One legislator asked him what he wanted, and Malik said simply, "For what happened to me to be impossible to happen to anyone else." Sarah's book was published to critical acclaim and commercial success, the reviews calling it essential reading and a devastating indictment of American justice. She donated half her advance to the Innocent Lives Foundation and used the rest to move her family to a different city where fewer people knew their story, where her children could have friends who didn't know their mother had been in prison. But at night, when she couldn't sleep, she still wrote letters to women in prison who claimed innocence, knowing that most were telling the truth, and that truth wasn't enough. Javier's non-profit grew to serve 3 states, funded by a combination of government grants and private donations from people who'd been moved by his story. He hired 7 formerly incarcerated people, including 2 who'd been exonerated, creating a team that understood the system from the inside and could navigate its failures with the expertise of survivors. His daughter, Sophia, graduated law school and joined the team. The trauma of her father's wrongful conviction transformed into a career defending others, the cycle of injustice broken by the determination to fight it. The story could end here, with freedom achieved and lives rebuilt, but that wouldn't be honest. The truth was that Malik still woke up at 4 a.m. for count that never came, that Sarah still had panic attacks in grocery stores that reminded her of the prison commissary, that Javier still felt his heart race whenever he saw police lights. The truth was that exoneration was not vindication, that freedom was not healing, that justice delayed was justice denied, even when it eventually arrived. They had fought wrongful convictions and won, but victory looked different than they'd imagined. It looked like survival rather than triumph, like endurance rather than redemption, like learning to live with scars that would never fully heal in a system that would never fully change. But they continued to fight, to speak, to witness, because that's what survivors do. They survived not just for themselves, but for the ones still inside, still fighting, still hoping that truth might matter enough to set them free. And in that fight, in that hope, in that refusal to let the system's failures become their own, they found something that transcended vindication or even justice. They found purpose in their pain, meaning in their struggle, and a kind of freedom that no wrongful conviction could take away. The freedom to transform injustice into action, trauma into testimony, and survival into a form of resistance that the system could neither contain nor control.